What would you do if the person you loved most in this world suddenly had nothing? No money. No status. No future. Would you stay? Most people say yes without even thinking twice. But when the moment actually comes, when the bank account hits zero, when the calls stop coming, when the house goes quiet, that's when you find out who someone really is. And what this man discovered about his wife changed everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and the life he had built. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Ethan Carter had always been the kind of man who could walk into a room and make it feel smaller. Not because he was loud or arrogant, but because of the weight he carried, the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from building something from nothing with your own two hands. By the time he was 43, Ethan had turned a small logistics company he started out of a rented garage in Denver, Colorado into a business empire worth over $2 billion. Freight contracts, warehouse investments, a fleet of trucks that stretched across 14 states. He had done all of it without a trust fund, without a famous last name, and without asking anyone for a single handout. And that mattered to him more than the money ever could. His office sat on the 31st floor of a gleaming tower downtown, and every morning, he would stand at the window with a cup of black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and look out at the city below. Not because he was proud, but because he needed the reminder of where he came from. Of the apartment on East Colfax where the heat sometimes cut off in January. Of the nights he ate peanut butter crackers for dinner because there was nothing else. Of the version of himself that swore one day, things would be different. And they were. They really were. But money, as Ethan would often say, is a strange thing. It gives you everything you think you wanted, and then it quietly takes away the one thing you never thought to protect, your ability to trust. He met Sarah on a Tuesday, which he always said was proof that the best things in life come when you're not expecting them. She was working at a small nonprofit in the Rhino neighborhood, organizing food drives and grant applications and doing the kind of work that doesn't pay well but says everything about a person's character. A mutual friend had dragged Ethan to a fundraising dinner he had no interest in attending. He had written a check and planned to leave early. Then Sarah laughed at something across the table, a real laugh, the kind that scrunches up the nose, and Ethan forgot entirely about leaving. They dated for 2 years before he proposed. He took her to a quiet Italian restaurant, not a famous one, not the kind of place that makes it onto travel blogs, just the small one on 5th Street where the owner knew his name and always brought extra bread without being asked. He didn't rent out the whole place. He didn't have a violinist waiting in the corner. He just reached across the table, slid the ring box forward, and said, "I don't want to do any of this without you." She said yes before he even finished the sentence. They married the following spring in a ceremony with 60 people, immediate family and close friends only, in a garden outside the city. Simple. Real. Exactly the way Ethan wanted it. For the first 3 years of their marriage, things were good. Better than good. Sarah continued her nonprofit work even after the wedding. She drove the same Honda she had before Ethan. She didn't redecorate the house with a designer, she didn't demand a wardrobe overhaul, and she never once made Ethan feel like the money was the point. She volunteered on weekends. She called his mother every week. She remembered the names of his employees' children. Ethan loved her with the kind of certainty that doesn't need to be spoken out loud. He just knew. But somewhere around their 4th year of marriage, something shifted. It was subtle at first, the way most changes are. Sarah started spending more time with a group of women she had met through a luxury lifestyle event that a friend had invited her to. Ethan didn't think much of it at first. People make new friends. That's normal. But gradually, he started noticing things. The shopping trips that lasted all day. The credit card statements with charges at stores he had never heard of. The conversations that went quiet when he walked into the room. The way she sometimes looked at him, not with warmth, but with a kind of measuring assessment, like she was calculating something. He told himself he was imagining it. Successful people can develop a tendency to be suspicious, he knew that. When you've worked that hard to get somewhere, it's easy to start seeing threats everywhere. He pushed the feeling down and went back to work. But then came the dinner party. It was at the home of one of Sarah's new friends, a woman named Stephanie, whose husband was a real estate developer known for his flashy lifestyle and louder personality. Over drinks, someone brought up the topic of prenuptial agreements, half-jokingly. Ethan had never asked Sarah to sign one, which had always felt right to him. He believed in them. He believed in her. But that night, after a glass of wine too many, one of the women in the group laughed and said, "Sarah, you better make sure you lock it down before the market shifts." And the others laughed. And Sarah laughed too. And Ethan smiled on the outside but felt something cold move through his chest. On the drive home, he waited for her to say something. To roll her eyes at the comment. To reach over and squeeze his hand the way she used to. But she just stared out the passenger window at the passing streetlights. And Ethan drove in silence, turning that laugh over and over in his mind. He didn't act impulsively. That was never his style. Ethan was a man who made calculated decisions, in business and in life. He sat with the discomfort for weeks, watching, paying attention. And the more he watched, the more uncertain he became. Not because Sarah had done anything dramatic or obvious, but because the small things were adding up. The way she talked about their life now, referring to their home as the estate, their cars as part of the collection, their social circles as contacts to maintain. Language that sounded less like a wife and more like a business partner managing assets. He brought it up gently one evening over dinner. He asked her if she was happy. She said of course. He asked her what she loved most about their life. She talked about the house, the trips, the event they were going to the following month. He waited for her to mention him. She didn't. He went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling for a long time. There was a man Ethan had known since childhood, his oldest friend, a quiet, sharp-minded attorney named Gary, who had warned him about this 3 years into the marriage. "I'm not saying she's a bad person, Ethan," Gary had told him over lunch one afternoon. "I'm saying that money changes people. And sometimes it changes the people around you without you even noticing until it's too late." Ethan had brushed it off then. Now, lying in the dark, he heard those words again like they were being spoken fresh. He called Gary the next morning. The plan, when they laid it out, was not something Ethan felt good about. He wanted to be clear about that, because it's important. He wasn't a man who enjoyed deception. He didn't like games. But he needed the truth. He needed to know, with absolute certainty, who Sarah was when the money disappeared. Because he was not willing to spend the rest of his life wondering. And so, with Gary's help and the assistance of a small team of trusted advisors, Ethan Carter began to quietly and deliberately make it appear that he had lost everything. It started with the business. Ethan arranged for a series of strategic announcements, a failed acquisition, a contract dispute with a major federal client, a liquidity problem that was reported in 2 regional business publications. All of it carefully staged. None of it public enough to cause real market panic, but visible enough for the people in their social circle to notice. Then the personal accounts. Ethan opened new accounts under a different structure and moved the majority of his actual wealth there, leaving the joint accounts looking nearly empty. He downgraded his company vehicle. He let the membership at the club they attended lapse. He came home one evening, sat Sarah down at the kitchen table, and told her, with his voice as steady as he could keep it, that they were in serious financial trouble. He watched her face very carefully. She didn't cry. She didn't reach for his hand. Her first question, after a moment of silence, was about the house. Are we going to lose the house? He said he didn't know. She asked about her credit cards. He said they would need to cut back significantly. She nodded slowly, and something behind her eyes went flat in a way that Ethan felt more than saw. He told her he was going to fix it. That he just needed time. That they would get through it together. She said okay. She said she believed in him. But the words came out evenly, polished and correct, like lines rehearsed before the scene. That night, she slept on her side of the bed with her back to him, and Ethan lay awake in the dark, wondering if the version of their life he had believed in had ever been fully real. Over the next 4 weeks, things deteriorated, at least on the surface. The housekeeper was let go. The weekend plans with their affluent friends quietly stopped materializing. Sarah's new friend group, the ones from the luxury events, began finding other arrangements. Invitations dried up. Calls came less frequently. Ethan watched Sarah navigate all of it with a composure that could have looked like strength, but felt more like withdrawal. She didn't fight. She didn't push. She didn't ask about his plan or offer to help. She simply became quieter. More distant. More absent in ways that didn't require physically leaving the room. And then, about 5 weeks into the situation, Ethan noticed something that stopped him cold. He had been going through his email, a habit he kept up even during this period, monitoring things carefully, when he came across a forwarded message that Gary had flagged for him. It was from a divorce attorney. A very well-known one in Denver with a reputation for handling high-asset separations. Sarah had made an inquiry. The message was dated 3 weeks after Ethan had sat her down at the kitchen table. He set his phone down on his desk. He didn't say anything. He sat in the chair for a long time, looking at the wall. Think about that for a second, and be honest with yourself. If you were Ethan, sitting alone at that desk, reading that email, knowing that the person who promised to love you through everything had already started looking for an exit before a month had even passed, what would you feel? Not what would you think, what would you feel? Gary came over that evening. They sat in Ethan's home office with the door closed, and Ethan told him what he had found. Gary didn't say, "I told you so." He just poured 2 glasses of water, set one in front of Ethan, and waited. Ethan stared at the table. He said, quietly, "I kept hoping I was wrong." Gary said, "I know." There wasn't much else to say. Ethan could have ended it there. He had what he needed. The test, as painful as it had been, had given him an answer. But something made him want to continue a little longer. Not out of cruelty. Not to punish Sarah. But because a part of him, the stubborn, hopeful part that had survived poverty and hard years and loneliness, needed to see if there was anything left underneath the surface. If there was any version of the woman he had proposed to in that quiet Italian restaurant still in there somewhere, waiting. 6 weeks in, Ethan hit the lowest point of the entire performance. He had, with Gary's guidance, allowed a story to circulate in their social circle that the business was effectively finished, that he had reached out to former investors, that legal proceedings might be inevitable. It was a drastic move. Ethan felt sick doing it. But he had committed to finding the truth, and so he followed it through. Sarah's behavior in this period was not dramatic. And that, in its own way, was the most telling thing of all. She was not cruel. She was not loud. She was simply disengaged. She stopped making dinner together the way they used to, a Sunday ritual they had kept since the first year of their marriage, old jazz records playing, both of them crowded around the stove. She stopped asking about his day. She started spending long afternoons out of the house without explanation. She slept with her phone face down on the nightstand. And in one moment that Ethan has said he will never forget, a moment that has stayed with him long after everything that followed. Sarah came into the living room while he was sitting on the couch, papers spread around him, looking exhausted. She looked at him for a moment. Just looked. And then she went back to the bedroom without saying a single word. "No, are you okay? No, can I help?" "Nothing." The sound of the bedroom door clicking softly shut might as well have been a gavel coming down. But here is where the story turns. Because Ethan, in all of his focus on Sarah, had not accounted for what was happening on the other side of his life. His mother, a 71-year-old woman named Ruth, had been told nothing about the test. She knew only what everyone else knew, that her son's business was in trouble and that he was struggling. And Ruth Carter, who had raised Ethan alone in that apartment on East Colfax, who had worked double shifts at a hospital laundry for years, who had gone without new shoes 3 winters in a row so Ethan could have school supplies, Ruth showed up at Ethan's house on a Thursday morning with a paper grocery bag in her arms. Inside was a container of the chicken and rice she used to make when he was a child. A $20 bill folded in half. And a handwritten note that said, "I don't have much. But what I have, I give to you. I love you no matter what you are worth. Keep going." Ethan read that note standing in the kitchen, and he cried. Properly cried, in the way grown men rarely allow themselves to, shoulders shaking, hand pressed over his mouth. Because Ruth had nothing to gain from that gesture. She didn't know it was a test. She didn't know the cameras weren't rolling or that the money was safe. She just knew her son was hurting. And she showed up. And then, Ethan thought about Sarah. About the attorney's email. About the silent nights and the closed door and the retreating. And something became permanently, irreversibly clear. Now, before we go any further, we want to ask you something directly. How would you feel if you were Ruth? If your child, the one you sacrificed everything for, was going through something painful, and you had almost nothing, but you still gathered what little you had and showed up with a paper bag and a handwritten note? And then ask yourself, how would it feel to know that the person standing beside your child, the one who made promises in front of 60 people in a garden, had already called a divorce lawyer before the first month was out? Leave us your honest thoughts in the comments. Because this story is not just about Ethan. It's about all of us. Ethan gave the situation 2 more weeks. During that time, he watched with a kind of heartbroken attentiveness. And he saw nothing that changed the picture. No moment of reaching out. No conversation where Sarah said, "I'm scared, but I'm not going anywhere." No Sunday evenings at the stove. No hand on his shoulder in the morning. She moved through the house like a person already preparing to leave, careful, surface level, waiting. And then came a phone call that Ethan had not planned for and that would prove to be the most pivotal moment of the entire story. It came from a man named Robert, a former business contact of Ethan's who had heard about the financial trouble through their shared social circle. Robert was not a close friend. He was the kind of man who appeared frequently in wealthy spaces, networked aggressively, and attached himself to successful people with the ease of someone who had practiced it for years. Ethan had always been polite to him but never particularly warm. He had no reason to be on the phone with Robert at all. But Robert did not call to offer help. He called, in the easy, casual tone of a man who didn't think he was doing anything wrong, to ask if Ethan had considered selling off the property portfolio. And in the course of that conversation, Robert let something slip, unintentionally, the way careless people often do. He mentioned Sarah's name in a context that made Ethan go very still. He referenced a conversation the two of them had apparently had about next steps. He caught himself almost immediately and changed the subject. But it was already out. And Ethan, who had spent 20 years in business learning to pay attention to what people reveal in the half-second before they realize they've revealed it, caught every word. He called Gary that same night. He told him what Robert had said. Gary was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Ethan, I think it's time to end this. Ethan agreed. The following morning, he asked Sarah to sit with him in the living room. She came in, settled into the chair across from him, not beside him on the couch, he noticed, but across, with the coffee table between them, and waited with that same composed, careful expression she had been wearing for weeks. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Tuesday dinners and the Italian restaurant on 5th Street. He thought about the nonprofit in Rhino and the woman who had driven a Honda and organized food drives. He thought about the laugh that scrunched up her nose. He thought about his mother's paper grocery bag and the $20 bill folded in half. And then he told Sarah the truth. He laid it out quietly and completely. The staged announcements. The restructured accounts. The cancelled memberships. All of it deliberate. All of it designed to show him who she would be when the safety net was gone. He did not say it with anger, which was the thing that surprised her most. He said it with a kind of exhausted clarity that was almost harder to sit across from than anger would have been. Sarah's composure broke. But not in the way Ethan had perhaps expected. She didn't reach for him. She didn't immediately confess or apologize. She got angry. She said it was manipulative. She said he had no right to test her like she was a variable in some experiment. She said that she had been in a difficult situation and anyone would have considered their options. Ethan let her speak. He sat with his hands folded, and he listened to everything she said. And when she finished, he said, quietly and without malice, the attorney's email was dated 18 days after I told you we were in trouble. 18 days. And in those 18 days, you never once asked me how you could help. The room went silent. Sarah looked at him, and something shifted in her expression, not guilt, exactly, but the particular look of a person who has been seen clearly and knows it. Ethan did not make a decision that morning. That is an important part of this story. He did not walk in with papers ready to sign. He was not a man who acted in anger or haste. He took 3 weeks, during which he and Sarah had a series of long, difficult, often painful conversations that were more honest than anything they had managed in the previous 2 years of their marriage. In those conversations, some things became clear. Sarah had genuinely loved him at the beginning. He believed that. She had not started their marriage as a calculated operator. But somewhere along the way, gradually, without a single dramatic moment, the money had become load-bearing in their relationship. It had become the structure that held up her sense of security and self and social identity. And when she thought it was gone, she had not retreated to him. She had retreated away from him. And she could not entirely explain why. She cried in those conversations, real tears, the kind that come from genuine confrontation with yourself. Ethan watched her and felt the particular sadness of caring about someone while knowing the truth about them. He reached out to a couples therapist. He was willing to try. He told Sarah that. But he also told her that he needed honesty above everything else going forward, and that included honesty about the contact with Robert. She confirmed it. It was, as Ethan had suspected, preliminary. She hadn't crossed a line she could not walk back from, but she had been standing very close to it. The therapy lasted 4 months. And at the end of 4 months, Ethan and Sarah made a decision together that might surprise you. They separated. Not with bitterness. Not with public drama. Not with lawyers shouting across conference tables. They separated with the quiet, sober acknowledgement of 2 people who had arrived at a clear-eyed understanding of who they were to each other and who they were not. Ethan was generous in the settlement, far more generous than he was legally required to be, because that was the kind of man he was. He did not punish her. He did not leak information to their social circle or allow the story to become a spectacle. He simply, deliberately, and peacefully moved forward. And Sarah, to her credit, in those final months, did something no one expected. She resigned from the social circles she had acquired over the past 2 years. She went back to nonprofit work. She reached out to Ethan's mother and apologized to her personally, sitting across from Ruth in that same small kitchen where Ethan had grown up, and saying the words out loud. Ruth, being Ruth, made her a cup of tea and told her she hoped she found peace. That was Ruth Carter. That was who she was. Ethan threw himself back into work, but differently than before. Something about those 8 weeks had changed his relationship to the empire he had built. He started spending more time in the logistics centers, talking to drivers and warehouse staff. He set up a scholarship fund for employees' children. He called his mother every single morning, not weekly, every morning. He started going to that small Italian restaurant on 5th Street again, sometimes alone, sometimes with Gary, sometimes with a table of old friends from the Denver days who didn't care about his net worth and never had. He also, in a quiet moment about 8 months after the separation, wrote a letter. Not to Sarah. Not to Robert. He wrote it to himself, the version of himself that had stood at the 31st floor window with black coffee, looking down at the city, needing the reminder of where he came from. He wrote about what he had learned. About how money, in large enough amounts, can become a kind of filter, distorting every relationship, every moment, every conversation, until you can no longer tell who is real and who is performing. He wrote about his mother and her paper grocery bag. He wrote about the Italian restaurant. He wrote about trust, and how rare it actually is, and how precious, and how a person should hold it more carefully than any asset or investment. He folded the letter and put it in the same desk drawer where he kept his mother's handwritten note. He has never shared it publicly. But Gary has said, in the years since, that it is the most honest thing Ethan has ever written. 2 years after the separation, Ethan met a woman named Claire at, of all places, a volunteer event organized by the nonprofit where Sarah used to work. Claire was a pediatric nurse, quiet and warm and completely unimpressed by anything Ethan owned or managed or was worth. She drove a 10-year-old Subaru and kept succulents on every available surface of her apartment. On their 3rd date, she told him she didn't want to know about his business unless he wanted to talk about it. He looked at her across the table and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Something simple. Something safe. They took things slowly. Very slowly. Ethan was careful in a new way now, not suspicious, not guarded, but careful the way someone is when they understand the true value of what they're handling. Claire never asked about the house or the accounts or the cars. She asked about Ruth. She asked about Denver and East Colfax and what Ethan had eaten for dinner when the heat cut off in January. She listened in a way that people only listen when they actually want to know. And Ethan, for the first time in years, felt like himself. Before we close this story, we want to sit with you in this for just a moment. Because what happened to Ethan is not really about a billionaire or a test or a dramatic reveal. At its core, this is a story about what every single person in a relationship quietly fears, the question of whether someone would stay if all the extraordinary things about your life simply went away. If the title was gone. If the paycheck shrunk. If the house got smaller and the trip stopped and the table at the restaurant disappeared. Would the person next to you lean in, or start looking for the exit? Think about your own relationships for a second. Think about the people in your life. Think about who showed up with the paper bag and the $20 bill. And think about who called the attorney. Ethan Carter still runs his company. He is still worth more money than most people will ever see in a lifetime. He still stands at that window in the morning sometimes, with his black coffee, looking down at the city. But the thing he values most, he will tell you, is not the view. It is the call he makes every single morning, 7:15 on the dot, without fail, to his mother in Denver. The woman who showed up. The woman who gave what she had without needing to know if it would matter. The woman who reminded him, in the most ordinary way imaginable, that real love doesn't calculate. It just shows up. With a paper bag. With a handwritten note. And it says, "I love you no matter what you are worth. Keep going." If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own life or the people in it, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us, would you have stayed? Would you have shown up with the paper bag? Or in that moment of fear and uncertainty, do you think part of you would have done what Sarah did? There's no shame in being honest. That's what makes us human. And sometimes the most important stories are the ones that ask us to look at ourselves without flinching. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because we tell stories like this every single week, and you don't want to miss what's coming next.